Boy, it has been a long time, hasn't it? Um, I've missed you. I've missed reading. I'm going to read a little passage from the Great Gatsby, and that might be all I get a chance to do tonight. I'm starting with page 39 and reading to the end of chapter 2. And just really excited to be back and reading this. I've missed doing it. Oh, man. All right, so we're at um, Tom Buchanan and Myrtle Wilson's little love shack in New York. They're having a party with her sister Catherine, with Mr. and Mrs. McKee, and with a new dog that they bought on the way from Myrtle's home, which is in the Valley of the Ashes, that she was able to purchase on the way to this little love nest that she and Tom have. Myrtle right now is explaining why she married her current husband. I married him, and I'm going to use a different voice from Myrtle. I want to try this a little bit. I married him because I thought he was a gentleman, she said finally. I thought he knew something about breeding, but he wasn't fit to lick my shoe. You were crazy about him for a while, said Catherine. Crazy about him? Myrtle cried incredulously. Who said I was crazy about him? I never was any more crazy about him than I was that man there. She pointed suddenly at me, and everyone looked at me accusingly. I tried to show by my expression that I played no part in her past. The only crazy I was when I married him. I knew right away I made a mistake. He borrowed somebody's best suit to get married in and never even told me about it. And the man came after it one day when he was out. She looked around to see who was listening. Oh, is that your suit? I said. This is the first I ever heard about it. But I gave it to him, and then I laid down and cried to beat the band all afternoon. She really ought to get away from him, resumed Catherine to me. They've been living over that garage for 11 years, and Tom's the first sweetie she's ever had. A bottle of whiskey, a second one, was now in constant demand by all present, except Catherine, who felt just as good on nothing at all. Tom rang for the janitor and sent him for some celebrated sandwiches, which were a complete supper in themselves. I wanted to get out and walk eastward toward the park through the soft twilight, but each time I tried to go, I became entangled in some wild, strident argument which pulled me back as if with ropes into my chair. Yet high over the city, our line of yellow windows must have contributed their share of human secrecies to the casual watcher in the darkening streets. And I was him too, looking up and wondering. I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. Myrtle pulled her chair close to mine, and suddenly her warm breath poured over me the story of her first meeting with Tom. It was on the two little seats facing each other that are always the last ones left on the train. I was going up to New York to see my sister and spend the night. He had on a dress suit, patent leather shoes, and I couldn't keep my eyes off him. Every time he looked at me, I had to pretend to be looking at the advertisement over his head. When we came into the station, he was next to me, and his white shirt front pressed against my arm. And so I told him I'd have to call a policeman, but he knew I lied. I was so excited that when I got into a taxi with him, I didn't hardly know I wasn't getting into a subway train. All I kept thinking about over and over was, you can't live forever. You can't live forever. She turned to Mrs. McKee, and the room rang full of her artificial laughter. My dear, she cried, I'm going to give you this dress as soon as I'm through with it. I've got to get another one tomorrow. I'm going to make a list of all the things I got to get. A massage and a wave and a collar for the dog, and one of those cute little ashtrays where you touch a spring, and a wreath with a black silk bow from Mother's grave. That'll last all summer. I gotta write down a list so I won't forget all the things I gotta do. It was 9 o'clock. Almost immediately afterwards, I looked at my watch and found it was 10. Mr. McKee was asleep on a chair with his fist clenched in his lap like a photograph of a man of action. Taking out my handkerchief, I wiped from his cheek the remains of the spot of dried lather that had worried me all afternoon. The little dog was sitting on the table, looking with blind eyes through the smoke and from time to time groaning faintly. People disappeared, reappeared, made plans to go somewhere, and then lost each other, searched for each other, and found each other a few feet away. Sometime toward midnight, Tom Buchanan and Mrs. Wilson stood face to face, discussing in impassioned voices whether Mrs. Wilson had any right to mention Daisy's name. "Daisy, Daisy, Daisy," shouted Mrs. Wilson. "I'll say it whenever I want to. Daisy, Daisy." Making a short, deft movement, Tom Buchanan broke her nose with his open hand. Then there were bloody towels upon the bathroom floor and women's voices scolding, and high over the confusion a long, broken wail of pain. Mr. McKee awoke from his doze and started in a daze toward the door. When he had gone halfway, he turned around and stared at the scene. His wife and Catherine scolding and consoling as they stumbled here and there amongst the crowded furniture with articles of aid, and the despairing figure on the couch bleating fluently and trying to spread a copy of Town Tattle over the tapestry scenes of Versailles. Then Mr. McKee turned and continued on out the door. Taking my hat from the chandelier, I followed. "Come to lunch one day," he suggested as we groaned down in the elevator. "Where?" "Anywhere." "Keep your hands off the lever," snapped the elevator boy. "I beg your pardon," said Mr. McKee with dignity. "I didn't even know I was touching it." "All right," I agreed. I'll be glad to." I was standing beside his bed, and he was sitting up between the sheets clad in his underwear with a great portfolio in his hands. Beauty and the Beast, Loneliness, Old Grocery Horse, Brooklyn Bridge. Then I was lying half asleep in the cold lower level of the Pennsylvania station, staring at the morning Tribune and waiting for the 4 o'clock train. End of chapter 2.